All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into something that's been making a lot of noise, especially up north.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking Trump 2.0, what a second Trump administration could mean for Canada.
Oh, wow.
And I know the latest news has a lot of people kind of nervous.
For sure.
So you specifically wanted to know what it all means for Canada. And well, we've got this brand new article from the Canadian Press. They break down who's who in Trump's new team and, more importantly, what they've said about Canada in the past.
Okay, so what's the takeaway? What's the vibe?
Well, the article doesn't really sugarcoat it. One expert even said, and I quote, "I don't see a whole lot of friends of Canada in there."
Not great, especially considering, the trade tensions, the tariffs,
Hmm.
all that friction from Trump's first term.
Yeah, definitely not the best starting point.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. Who are these figures that have experts worried, and what exactly have they said or done that has everyone on edge?
All right, well, let's start with Stephen Miller, Trump's pick for, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. He's been pretty outspoken about Canada.
Oh, yeah. Like, what's he said?
He's called Canada authoritarian and despotic and labeled Trudeau far left.
Wow. Okay, strong words.
Yeah, and he seems to be pointing to things like gun control and certain social programs to back up his claims.
Interesting. So he's painting this picture of Canada as, like, sliding towards authoritarianism.
Exactly.
Huh.
And that kind of framing, it's meant to appeal to a specific part of the U.S. population.
Right. And the big question is, will these perceptions actually turn into concrete policy decisions?
Yeah, that's the concern. If perceptions are driving the decision-making process, especially if those perceptions are a little, off base.
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely concerning. And it's not just Miller, right?
Right. We've also got Mike Waltz, Trump's choice for national security advisor. He's been very publicly critical of Trudeau, especially when it comes to China.
I could see that being a point of contention.
Yeah, and he even went so far as to openly endorse Kovalyev.
Wait, what?
Yeah, endorsed him.
Seriously, a U.S. official meddling in Canadian politics like that,
Yeah, it's a pretty bold move.
yeah, it's a big deal. What message does that send to Canada? I mean, how does that affect our sovereignty?
Yeah, it's a significant break from diplomatic norms, and it definitely doesn't paint a rosy picture for future relations.
Okay, so we've got one guy calling Canada authoritarian, another endorsing a Canadian political candidate. Anyone else we should be worried about?
Oh, yeah. We've got Tom Hullman, the incoming border czar. He's straight up called the Canada-U.S. border a national security issue.
Hold on, does that mean longer lines at the border for Canadians? What's he worried about specifically?
Well, he's really focused on this idea of Canada being a gateway for terrorists trying to enter the U.S.
The gateway for terrorists. Seriously.
Yeah, and that suggests he might push for tighter border controls, even if the evidence for that kind of threat from Canada is pretty thin.
So even if it's more about perception than reality, Canadians can still face real consequences when they try to cross the border.
Exactly. And it's not just about security either. We've got Marco Rubio likely to be Secretary of State, and he's been pretty vocal about Canada's immigration policies.
What's he said?
He sees them as too lax and a security risk, which could impact everything from refugee programs to how border security is managed.
Okay, so that's two potential headaches at the border. And what about trade? Any red flags there?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Considering the amount of trade between our two countries, this could throw a wrench into things.
So are we talking more delays at the border? More inspections?
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
And it could even extend to the movement of goods and services.
So disruptions in supply chains, added costs for businesses. This is starting to sound pretty bad.
It's not great. And then there's Elise Stefanik, Trump's pick for UN ambassador. She's also focused on the northern border, but her main concern is trafficking.
Trafficking, okay. And what's her background on this? Does she have any experience in foreign policy?
Well, she's got limited foreign policy experience, but a very strong stance on Israel.
So how does that translate into Canada's role at the UN?
That's a bit of a wild card. It's hard to say how that'll play out.
Okay, so we've got potential problems at the border, possible trade disruptions, and a U.S. official openly endorsing a Canadian political candidate. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And, when you look at all these individuals together, a pattern emerges.
What do you mean?
Well, they're all at least deeply skeptical of Canada and its policies.
So what does that mean for Canada's overall relationship with the U.S.?
That's the million-dollar question. And so far, it's not looking too sunny.
Yeah, not great. But, the article did mention a couple of names that seemed a bit more balanced in their views.
True. There's Kristi Noem, the pick for Homeland Security. Now, she has been critical of Canada in the past, especially on energy and environmental issues.
Okay, so not exactly a fan.
But she's also acknowledged the benefits of the USMCA trade agreement.
Wait, hold on. For those who might not be up on their trade lingo, what exactly is USMCA? Why is it important?
Oh, right. Good point. USMCA stands for the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It's basically the updated version of NAFTA.
Ah, okay. So it governs trade between the three countries.
Exactly. And it's super important for Canada because the U.S. is by far our biggest trading partner.
So if no one sees value in USMCA, does that mean there's at least some hope for maintaining those trade ties?
It's possible. It suggests that maybe there's some pragmatism within the administration, at least when it comes to economic interests.
Okay, so a glimmer of hope on the trade front. Anyone else on Trump's team who might offer a more moderate approach to Canada?
Well, there's Robert Lighthizer, Trump's former trade representative. He's reportedly still in contact with Canadian officials.
Interesting. And what's his reputation? Is he someone who could help smooth things over?
Well, he's known for being a tough negotiator, but he also understands the complexities of trade and the importance of the Canada-U.S. relationship.
So potentially a voice of reason. Someone who can bridge the gap and advocate for a more balanced approach.
Possibly. And it highlights that even within an administration that seems kind of hostile towards Canada, there might be individuals willing to have a constructive dialogue.
That's reassuring to some degree. But let's be real. Even with these potential moderating voices, the overall picture is still pretty concerning. So what does this all mean for everyday Canadians? How could this actually impact their lives?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting and potentially worrisome. We could see those increased wait times and more stringent checks at the border, not just for people, but for goods, too.
Travel headaches and economic impacts. What else?
This could also have a ripple effect on Canada's international reputation.
How so?
Well, if U.S. officials are constantly pushing negative narratives about Canada, it could damage our standing on the world stage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You make it harder to build relationships with other countries?
Exactly. And let's not forget about the psychological impact.
Right, how Canadians feel about all of this.
Yeah, Canadians' perceptions of the U.S., their willingness to travel there, even their sense of security, all of that could be affected.
It's a lot to process. It's not just about policies and the economy. It's about how people feel about their place in the world.
Absolutely. It's a complex web of interconnected issues, and it's tough to predict how it'll all unfold.
So what should Canadians do? How should they prepare?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that knowledge is power. The more informed Canadians are about the potential risks and opportunities, the better equipped they'll be to navigate whatever comes next.
So stay tuned, folks. We're going to keep digging into this. We'll explore the potential challenges and opportunities, and hopefully you'll walk away feeling more informed and empowered to deal with whatever comes next.
Sounds good. I'm ready to dive deeper.
Me too. Let's do it.
One area where this shift in U.S. policy could really hit us is the economy. You know, we saw a glimpse of this during Trump's first term with those tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum.
Yeah, those tariffs definitely rattled some cages. I remember people were worried about a potential trade war.
Yeah, and for good reason. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce estimated that if those tariffs were brought back, the Canadian economy could shrink by like $30 billion a year.
Whoa, that's a huge number.
It is, and it would be felt everywhere by businesses, by consumers.
Yeah.
Everyone.
So we're talking job losses, price increases, a general economic slowdown. Not a pretty picture.
Not at all. And it's not just tariffs either. This article points out Trump's criticism of foreign aid, specifically aid to Ukraine.
Interesting. So what does that mean for Canada?
Well, it could signal a broader shift in U.S. foreign policy, you know, where they pull back from international commitments and focus inward.
Right, America first and all that.
Yeah, and that puts Canada in a tough spot. We've been a big supporter of Ukraine financially and militarily. If the U.S. scales back its support, it's kind of like...
Do we step up to fill the gap or risk damaging our relationship with Ukraine?
Exactly. It's a tricky situation. And then there's NATO, which has been a cornerstone of Canada's security for decades.
Right, a big deal for sure.
Yeah. And the article mentions that Trump and some of his new team, like Mike Waltz, they've been critical of NATO members who aren't spending enough on defense.
Yeah, I've heard about that 2% target that NATO members are supposed to hit.
Right. And Canada, we've been lagging behind.
Trudeau's plan is to reach it by 2032, which seems pretty relaxed compared to the urgency that Trump and his team might demand.
Totally. And that could put a lot of pressure on Canada to boost military spending.
Which might not be popular with everyone.
Definitely not. And it could mean taking money away from other priorities like healthcare, education, social programs.
More for the military, less for everything else. That's a tough trade-off for Canadians to consider. All this talk about Trump's team being skeptical of Canada makes me wonder, what exactly are they so worried about? What do they see as the biggest threats coming from us?
That's a good question. And I think it's important to remember that in politics, perceptions often drive actions, even if those perceptions aren't totally accurate.
Yeah, perception is reality, as they say.
Exactly. Take Tom Homan, for example, his view of the border as a national security risk. It's probably shaped by a certain worldview, one that emphasizes threats and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, the article quotes him saying Canada can't be a gateway for terrorists entering the U.S. Pretty strong stuff.
Definitely. And it suggests that he might be more likely to take a hard line on border security, even if the evidence doesn't necessarily support it.
Right, so even if it's more perception than reality, the impact on Canadians could be very real.
Absolutely. And it's not just about terrorism either. Marco Rubio's concerns about Canada's immigration policies, they also stem from a belief that they're too lenient and could be a security risk.
So that kind of thinking could lead to pressure on Canada to tighten our borders,
Hmm.
adopt more restrictive immigration policies, maybe even align our foreign policy more closely with the U.S.
Exactly. And that really highlights the need for Canada to be proactive in communicating our policies and perspectives to the new U.S. administration.
Right, so it's not about being defensive or apologetic. It's about making sure that Canada's voice is heard and that our interests are understood.
Precisely.
Okay.
It's about managing the narrative, ensuring that the relationship isn't defined solely by the voices of those who are skeptical or critical.
Right, because if we don't actively shape the conversation, those negative perceptions could become the dominant narrative, and that could have long-term consequences.
Absolutely. Now, while it's important to acknowledge the potential challenges and risks, it's also crucial to keep a balanced perspective and not get lost in worst-case scenarios. There might be areas where Canada and the U.S. can still find common ground and even opportunities that come out of this situation.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about those potential positives. Where do we see the possibility for cooperation or maybe even some unexpected benefits that might emerge from this new dynamic?
Well, remember Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security pick? While she's criticized Canada on some things, she's also expressed support for the USMCA trade agreement.
Right, so maybe there's some room for cooperation there.
If she's willing to work within that framework, it could provide a basis for continued economic cooperation.
That's good news for Canadian businesses who rely on that trade relationship. And are there other areas where we might see some alignment of interests?
Well, there's Robert Lighthizer, the former trade representative, who's reportedly still in contact with Canadian officials.
So maybe a channel for communication and some problem solving when it comes to trade issues.
It's definitely possible. And, despite the political differences, there are many areas where Canada and the U.S. have common goals.
Like what?
While combating climate change, promoting democracy and human rights, collaborating on scientific research and innovation, there's a lot of potential for cooperation.
Yeah, you're right. We tend to focus on the disagreements, but it's important to remember all the things that unite us as neighbors and allies.
Absolutely. And those shared interests can be a foundation for building bridges and finding common ground, even when things are politically tricky.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's still room for optimism and a belief that we can work through these difficulties and come out with a strong and mutually beneficial relationship.
I agree. It's about finding that balance between acknowledging the risks and staying open to the possibilities.
And speaking of possibilities, this whole situation got me thinking, what if this shift in U.S. policy actually creates some unexpected opportunities for Canada?
Now, that's an intriguing thought. What do you have in mind?
Well, what if the U.S. becoming less engaged internationally, as the article suggests, creates a space for Canada to step up and play a more prominent role on the world stage?
That's interesting. Canada has always been a strong supporter of multilateralism and a rules-based international order. If the U.S. retreats from that role, maybe Canada could step in.
Right, so instead of just following the U.S. lead, Canada could forge its own path, build stronger relationships with other countries, and become a more influential player globally.
It's definitely a possibility. It would require Canada to be more assertive and strategic in its foreign policy, but it could also be a chance to redefine our role in the world.
That's pretty exciting. And what about the economic front? Could there be any silver linings there?
Well, if the U.S. goes a protectionist route with trade like it did during Trump's first term, it could create opportunities for Canadian businesses to diversify their markets and explore new partnerships.
So instead of relying so much on trade with the U.S., Canadian companies could look to expand into Europe, Asia, other parts of the world.
Exactly. It could spark innovation and entrepreneurship as Canadian businesses seek out new customers and partners.
So a more diversified and resilient Canadian economy.
It's certainly possible. And even if there are economic challenges, Canadians have a history of adapting and being resilient.
We've been through tough times before we can do it again.
Absolutely. And that spirit of resilience and optimism is something we should all hold on to.
Couldn't agree more. So even though things might be a bit bumpy, there's also a sense of possibility and even some excitement about what the future holds.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance, being ready for the challenges, but also staying open to the opportunities.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up, I think there's one more crucial point we need to touch on. This whole situation, it's not just about politics and economics, right? It's also about people, about the human impact of these changes.
You're absolutely right. It's important to remember that behind every policy decision, every trade agreement, every border crossing, there are real people whose lives are being affected.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So as we navigate these complex issues, let's not forget about the human element, the stories of individuals and families who were impacted by these changes.
I couldn't agree more. It's those stories that remind us why these issues matter, why we need to engage, and why we need to find solutions that work for everyone.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the potential challenges to the opportunities, for the policy implications to the human impact. It's been a great conversation, and I hope our listeners feel more informed and empowered to navigate whatever comes next.
I hope so too. And I think the key message here is that while the future is uncertain, knowledge is power and engagement is essential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. And who knows, maybe we'll even find a way to turn these challenges into opportunities for a brighter future.
I like the opportunities for a brighter future. I think that's a great note to end on.
Me too. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. As always, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues, to stay curious, and to stay connected.
And remember, the future is what we make it.
Well said. Until next time, happy diving.
You know, one thing that really stuck with me from the article is how often they talk about the border. The U.S.-Canada border. It comes up again and again.
Yeah, like it's this big flashing red light for them.
Exactly. A lot of these figures in Trump's administration, they see the border as a weak point.
Whether it's security, immigration, even drug trafficking.
Right. It's like they see Canada as this giant back door into the U.S.
And that perception, even if it's exaggerated or just plain wrong, it could have real consequences.
Oh, absolutely. We've already talked about longer wait times, more scrutiny at border crossings, but it could go even further.
Like what? What else could they do?
Well, they might push for a stricter enforcement of the rules we already have, maybe even introduce brand new ones.
So more paperwork, more background checks, maybe even physical barriers like walls or fences.
It's possible. And think about what that would mean for businesses that rely on cross-border trade.
Every shipment held up, every truck driver delayed. It would add a ton of friction and cost.
Exactly. And it's not just the economic impact either.
Right, there's a human element too.
This kind of heightened security focus, it could create a climate of suspicion and distrust.
It would be a shame if all those everyday interactions, the friendships and family ties across the border, if those were to suffer because of politics.
It's a good reminder that we're not just talking about abstract policies. We're talking about real people whose lives are connected across that border.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the big picture. But it's the human stories that really matter in the end. But, even with all these potential challenges, the Canada-U.S. relationship is complicated.
Wow.
It's not going to be completely defined by one administration or a few appointees, right?
No, definitely not. There are a lot of people on both sides who are working hard to keep things positive and cooperative.
Like diplomats, business leaders, community organizations, just everyday folks who want to build bridges and find common ground.
Exactly. And those efforts are so important, especially when things are uncertain. It reminds us that the relationship is bigger than any one person or political party.
At the end of the day, Canada and the U.S. share a lot. We're neighbors, allies, major trading partners.
We have a long history of working together, and those ties run deep.
That's a really important takeaway, I think.
Yes, there are challenges ahead, and there are reasons to be concerned. But there's also a lot of goodwill and shared interests that can help us through this.
I completely agree. And, maybe we can use this as a chance to step back and look at the relationship with fresh eyes.
To have those tough conversations about where we stand and where we want to go from here.
Exactly. Instead of just reacting to whatever happens, maybe we can be more proactive.
Articulate our own vision for the relationship and work towards a future that benefits both countries.
Absolutely. And that's what we try to do here at the Deep Dive, to give you the information and insights you need to be informed, engaged, and ready to make your own decisions.
To be part of the conversation.
Exactly. So until next time, keep diving deep. Keep those critical thinking skills sharp. And remember, even in uncertain times, there's always hope for a brighter future.
Well said. Couldn't have put it better myself.
Thanks for joining me today. It's been a great conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.